Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back for, I can't believe it, our final week of 2024's language documentation webinars. Hope everybody is doing well today for one of the most exciting sessions, week 8, language revitalization, and a little bit of discussion of funding, the very difficult topic of where to find some resources to do this work. So, first up, it is, in fact, our last class of the 2024 webinars, and I just want to thank everybody for being here every week, for your insightful questions, sharing your knowledge and experiences, and just making this a really wonderful space to learn together. So thank you to all of you. And in recognition of all of the time and effort and knowledge that you all have brought to these webinars, we will be awarding certificates of participation to all of you who have attended. Like we've said in the emails, if you attended most of the Zoom sessions, you automatically get a certificate. If you've been watching on Zoom or on YouTube or otherwise not joining live, that's also totally fine. Just email us if you would like a certificate. That's no problem at all. And at the end of this class, you're going to get a little survey up on your Zoom screen. If you want to share your feedback for how we can continue to make these webinars better, more helpful, more useful, please share your thoughts. We would really, really value your feedback. So please do that survey when you see it at the end of the meeting today. So let's get right into language revitalization. And I want us to start by prefacing this with a caveat. I don't have the really crucial insights or experiences or the knowledge of a person who is revitalizing their own language. I am a English speaker for many generations back in my family, and so I'm coming to this as an outsider. And there is so much that I can't cover from where I am. And there are some wonderful resources for learning more about language revitalization from people who do have this kind of knowledge sprinkled all throughout these slides. So I really encourage you to check those out. But what is language revitalization? Let's back up. What are we even talking about here? In the broadest sense, we're talking about any kind of effort to strengthen or promote a language that's experiencing language shift or that's at risk of language shift, right? A language doesn't even necessarily have to be quote unquote endangered in order to be revitalized. It's just anything to push back against potential or real language shift. And oftentimes this involves things like creating new speakers of the language, right? Helping more people learn the language or helping people improve their skills in it. So this could be described as increasing speaker numbers. This could also involve helping people use the language more. That means more often, more comfortably in more parts of their life. And this activity of creating new spaces or opportunities to use the language in your everyday life is referred to as growing the domains of use. And this also generally includes things like rights, awareness, advocacy, promotion of a language, right? Changing public attitudes towards the language, getting more people interested in learning, reclaiming, supporting the language. All of these things are language revitalization. And this is the word we're using here is revitalization. We use that one mostly at ELP because it's widely known. It's a very general term that can cover lots of things. But there are also a lot of other terms out there that refer to this general kind of work. And so maybe you've seen terms like language revival, language reclamation, maintenance, awakening, other words that have similar meanings. So let's take a second and unpack those. Maintenance, in a general sense, means keeping a language stable, right? Maintaining where it's at. And this often refers to preventing a decline in how often people use it or how many people use it. This means sort of stopping language shift before it starts. And then revival is sort of at the other end of the spectrum. It's often used in a similar way to awakening, but not always. But in many cases, people use these two terms to mean creating new speakers of a language which was previously sleeping, right? Which previously did not have any living speakers or signers. And so awakening is sort of the process that comes after a language has gone to sleep to wake it back up. And reclamation is sort of a more complex concept. It's a broader thing than just revitalization, which refers pretty specifically to work around the language itself. Reclamation is sort of a broader component of a social, political, emotional, and cultural effort to reclaim autonomy, to reclaim sovereignty, to regain community power, and to reclaim the rights of a people to use their language. And it also often focuses more on Indigenous epistemologies, ways of knowing, ways of understanding what language is. And so reclamation is a bigger picture thing than revitalization, but also very much about bringing a language into people's lives, strengthening it, and perpetuating it for the future. And there's a great link to a paper exploring the concept of language reclamation in more depth there. And so, some of the common goals, I think these probably sound familiar to a lot of you. These may be things that you are thinking about how to do in your communities. Some of the really common goals are to help people reconnect to lots of different things, right? Language endangerment is fundamentally an issue of disconnection, of disruption, of relationships being ruptured or torn apart. And so when people reconnect to their language in the process of language revitalization, it's often about repairing and restoring and renewing connections to language, to culture, to community, to ancestors, to lands, right? Repairing all kinds of connections. But also, in very literal terms, it's about increasing how many people who can speak or sign the language, increasing how much they use the language in their everyday life. It might also focus on gaining or upholding language rights, right? So the official status that a language has, the legal rights that someone has to use or apply that language. And this could include things like making it possible to use your language in government or court settings, in educational settings, right? Having it be present in shops and hospitals and other parts of civic life. And this also, sometimes a goal is just to raise awareness that a language is there, that it's living, that it's spoken, that it's present. And sometimes this includes things like just making sure more people can see the language on signs, on street names, on place names, or just encouraging folks to use greetings in their daily life. Even if they don't fully know the language, they can adopt a few words symbolically. And a common goal that I want to unpack a little bit more because it might not be intuitive to everybody, but a common goal in language revitalization ties back to that first point, right? That reconnecting. Language revitalization is also, in very, very many cases, about improving people's well-being. And you might think like, well, what does what languages I know have to do with my well-being? A lot, let me tell you. So actually, language revitalization has been shown in all kinds of research, both academic research, community research, lived experience, right? All of these things show that language revitalization contributes to people's healing and health and general well-being. So here are a bunch of studies linked that you can check out if you like, but language revitalization and language reclamation and maintenance have been shown to relate to lower rates of diabetes, smoking tobacco, drug and alcohol abuse, right? It's related to better physical health, right? People's bodies being in better shape. And it also relates to people's minds and spirits and emotions being in better shape. It improves mental health and emotional well being. So, a really impactful study showed that in Indigenous communities in Canada, communities that have maintained or revitalized their Indigenous languages have lower rates of youth suicide, which is enormously important. Better mental health overall is linked to language revitalization, and so is a greater sense of identity and belonging, right? Feeling comfortable with who you are socially as a person in the world. And there are also broader societal benefits, right? There's research linking language revitalization to better economic opportunities, better economic health for a community, as well as rates of graduating from secondary school. And so all of this really points to the fact that language is not just narrowly about language. Language revitalization is part of a broader project of contributing to people's and communities' well being. It's so important because it has concrete benefits for real people in the real world that go so far beyond language. I see it in the chat. I never knew about this, but I've never thought about it in this way. Yeah, it's incredible. I hope y'all will check out some of this research. And so, just to rewind all the way back to week one, right? Things are currently very difficult for global language diversity. More languages are currently at risk of falling silent than they ever have been. Those rates are accelerating. It's happening everywhere in the world. This is as bad a time for language diversity as any time in known human history. But that's a grim statistic, but there's also a really bright side, which is that the rates of language reclamation and revitalization are now also higher than ever. People in communities all over the world are rising up to meet that challenge to resist language endangerment. And there was a really helpful study in 2019 by Gabriela Perez Baez and her colleagues, and they looked at language revitalization initiatives all over the world. They did a survey, and 245 different revitalization programs responded to it. And that is a really enormous number of programs. It is not all the programs in the world, however. There are probably a ton of revitalization initiatives that were not included in that survey, and even more that have started since the survey was done. And so ELP is actually continuing and expanding that survey of revitalization efforts. If you would like to contribute knowledge about your own revitalization work, we invite you to do that. That would be wonderful. And the important thing, well, among the many important things in that survey, there was this interesting graph about what year the language revitalization programs they talked to had begun. And so a very small number of them had started in the 1960s or earlier, right? A lot of those would be in Europe, Celtic language revival programs. In the 1970s, you see a slightly higher number of programs starting. But if you look at the 1980s onward, every single decade, there's a really steep increase of revitalization programs. And if you're looking at the post 2010 bar here at the end and wondering, hey, that looks like it went down, that's only because this survey stopped being conducted at the beginning of 2017. So this really only represents about the first half of the 2010s, the first 6 years of the 2010s. And so if they had surveyed all the way up through 2020, I think that number would be way up here somewhere, right? You'd see another really steep increase every decade of revitalization initiatives. And so, about two-thirds of all known revitalization efforts in the world have started just since the year 2000. This is work, this is a movement that is growing in every part of the world and continuing to grow. And so, yes, things are really, really rough for languages all over the world right now, but people are rising up to that moment. They are responding to it by reclaiming and revitalizing their languages. And there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful about that. So it's good to know that this is happening, but it's more helpful to know exactly what people are doing so that we can take some lessons from that and start thinking about how maybe y'all can do this work in your own communities. And so let's think about what are some of the ways people are doing this, and then also which of these might work for your language and your community, right? What lessons can you take and apply where you are? Well, there are a lot of ways to approach this work, right? It's language revitalization can happen on many different scales. It could be at the very large scale, which means at the country level, right? This could be an entire nation deciding to promote and sustain a specific language. This could be at the level of a smaller community or a district. And so, some really well known examples of these large scale revitalization efforts include Israeli or Hebrew, depending on who you're asking about the language name. The languages of Scotland and Ireland, Olelo Hawaii, obviously, which is now one of the two official languages of the state of Hawaii. Maori is clearly a huge success story. The entire nation of Aotearoa putting a lot of effort into the revitalization and reclamation of Maori. But these kind of large scale projects are harder to do if you don't have a national government working on it, right? They require a lot of funding, a lot of resources, a lot of people, a lot of policy support. So this is something that it's pretty difficult to do as an individual or a small group. However, if that's your area of interest, if you are interested in this kind of high level language policy and advocacy, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which we are in right now, 2022 to 2032, the UN International Decade of Indigenous Languages is a really good time to push for this kind of support from nation and state governments. So if you're interested in language advocacy and policy work, now's the time. Let's go. But for most of us here in this room, I think, small scale initiatives are probably more relevant to what we are able to do, to where we can start. And so this is generally at the individual level, things that you could do just as a person, things that you could do in your family or at the local level, right? You could work on using and transmitting your language in your home. This could be at a community center or in a particular school. This could be a group of friends starting a club to, I don't know, knit together in the language, whatever you decide to do. There are a lot of things that are achievable without a ton of resources or funding or official support, right? DIY or do it yourself style language revitalization. There are lots of options. And these are things that you could start doing if you had the desire. Oh, I see in the chat, can you share the PDF versions of the references by email? Yes, I will share those. Yeah, so small scale, let's talk a little bit about that since that's probably most relevant to us here today. So our first method to talk about would be language nests. I'm just curious, how many folks here have heard of language nests? Just put a yes in the chat if you've heard about language nests, if you're familiar with the concept. Ah, I see a yes with an exclamation point. Awesome. Lots of yeses. This is great to see. Yeah, so this may be a review then for a lot of you, but a language nest is essentially an immersion learning program for babies and really small children, right? It's essentially a daycare in the language. And immersion refers to education or childcare that uses pretty much only the language that you're revitalizing. And you generally try to avoid having any of the dominant or colonial language there in the nest. And it's metaphorical, right? It's a nest for young things where they are cared for and can grow up safely surrounded by language. And one metaphor that works really well for language nests, they've been described as grandmother's house, right? It's a space where elders and other strong or fluent speakers are there to help care for and talk with and surround babies and small kids with the language. And that's just a beautiful way of thinking about it, right? This is something any of us can do. You can take a child to grandmother's house in most ways, in most places. And so a language nest is supposed to sort of replicate that experience, just a safe, comfortable, home-like setting for kids to hear the language. And these started in the 1980s in Aotearoa as the Kohangareo program, which literally is a language nest. And this started back in 1982 and grew incredibly fast. So 3 years after the first Kohangareo, there were 300 of them all over Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there are currently over 460 of them with 9,000 kids enrolled. Actually, I think the statistic is a couple years old, so it's probably more kids now. And that is a lot of kids in a country the size of Aotearoa. That's about 5% of all children who are in daycare or early childhood education. And while there is a lot of government support now, a lot of public support, this really started as a purely community based movement. This was Maori folks doing this work to make this happen from the very beginning. And then, of course, people talk, people share good ideas across contexts. And The next place that language nests moved to were the Punana system, the Hawaiian language nest system. And so a bunch of Hawaiian language activists got to chatting with Maori language activists. There's a wonderful talk sort of giving an oral history of this exchange of ideas by Dr. Larry Kimura. I'll share that link too. But they got together and they said, hey, we could do this in Hawaii. We should try this. And so in 1984, the first Punana Leo opened on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. And now there are 11 preschools on all five of the main Hawaiian islands. And they are serving hundreds, if not thousands, of kids every year. And this is really incredibly impressive because the first Punana Leo opened when it was still actually illegal for Hawaiian to be used as a medium of education. Most people might not think about that either, but until 1986, it was not legal to use the Hawaiian language in Hawaii to teach kids at school, which is nuts. But that changed thanks again to the dedication and activism and efforts of Hawaiian language champions like the folks who started the Punana Leo. So if you're thinking, this sounds great, we should have a language nest. Well, good news, it's actually pretty feasible to start a language nest without a ton of resources. So most of what you'll need are people who know the language, first of all. If there are fluent elders who have the energy and the patience and the time for little kids, they're great. They're great people to have at the language nest. Try, if you can, include a few elders, not just one, so that they can talk to each other and kids can see adults having fluent conversations and absorb that. And then, of course, you probably also want some younger adults as part of the language nest so that they can help out and carry kids around and do the cooking and all the physical active stuff that, the elders don't necessarily need to be doing. And then, of course, there will need to be some kids there to be learning and acquiring the language. And ideally, those kids should also have parents and families who are really committed to the kids learning and using the language. If the parents can also start learning and using the language so that the kids have someone to talk to at home, it's a challenge, but it really, really supports the kids as they grow up, having folks to talk to in the language. And then, you need some place to have the language nest. Some place needs to be the language nest. And that can be basically anywhere that's like a safe physical space to have a bunch of kids gathered all day. So a house, a community center, whatever you've got available that is an appropriate space for little kids. And language nests are really, really successful because this probably is intuitive to all of you. Small children learn language really, really fast, really fast, infinitely faster than an adult learns, right? They're like little sponges for language. And so when you start raising kids from infancy or toddlerhood, they become good speakers very quickly. And that also helps language sort of ripple out to their families, their parents, their siblings, and brings it back into the community through those young new speakers. And here are some fantastic resources if you want to learn more about language nests or even think about starting your own language nest in your community. I'll send these links around. All right, so immersion education, right? We did just talk about how language nests are a form of immersion. And immersion education is generally used to refer to education for slightly older kids as they grow out of language nest age. This, again, just refers to providing education in mostly or totally the language being revitalized. So from kindergarten to older levels. And if possible, in immersion education, most or all subjects can be taught in the language. Some people do sort of like a bilingual transition where you start out entirely in the language and move to the national or official or dominant language later. Or you could just do sort of an even mix, but bilingual education is not quite the same as immersion education. Uh, See in the comments, the community I'm working with are currently working towards establishing immersion programs. Fantastic. Congratulations. Please let us know how it's going. We want to hear about it. And So this can be done at the primary school level, the secondary school level, or even up through university and postgraduate programs. It does take a lot of resources, but it is possible. So, for example, today in Hawaii, a kid can go to school from the time they are like 1 year old all the way through their PhD in just Olelo Hawaii, in the Hawaiian language. And if you remember what we were saying about how Hawaiian was illegal to use as a medium of education just 40 years ago, that's a massive change. That is a really rapid turnaround. And so, again, this is a great example of what is possible with a lot of community participation, support, and effort. And another great example of immersion education in Hawaii. This actually, I used to drive by this on the way to class at the University of Hawaii every day. And so the Kekula Kaiapuni o Aonoinoi is a K through 12 school. I guess outside the US, you would say like a kindergarten through secondary school. Again, full Hawaiian immersion. English is introduced in older grades as a subject, but most of the classes are taught in Hawaiian. And the curriculum itself focuses on traditional cultural practices, right? So you're not just teaching purely dominant Western American curriculum subjects in Hawaiian, you're teaching Hawaiian knowledge, you're teaching Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian ways of living in Hawaiian as your curriculum. And so let's say maybe you don't quite have the resources or the people or the time to start a whole school. Most of us don't have time to start a whole school. What can we do at a much smaller scale? Let's say you really need to create speakers. And for whatever reason, working with little kids isn't reasonable or possible just yet. How do you create adult speakers if there are no formal textbooks or curricula or, I don't know, Duolingo courses or whatever? How do you create adult speakers with very few resources? Well, mentor-apprentice programs are another incredibly successful model for doing that. Again, it doesn't require a teaching license or textbooks or all of these sort of formal structures. Really, it requires someone who knows the language, a fluent speaker or signer. Oftentimes, this is an elder, right? Because you also want, ideally, to be transmitting knowledge, cultural knowledge, traditional knowledge, all kinds of stuff along with the language. So the person who's a fluent speaker is the mentor or the master. Some people say master apprentice, some people say mentor apprentice. And they are partnered with one, sometimes two or three. Sometimes you can have two or three apprentices, but that's a lot of work for the mentor. And these are usually adult learners, sometimes people who are training to be language teachers, sometimes parents who want to transmit the language to their kids, sometimes just young adults who are really, really committed to language learning. And I say all you have to do, this is really hard and complicated, but it's simple in a way. The mentor and the apprentice just spend a lot of time together, talking, doing activities, living their lives, sharing space and time, and doing it only in the language. And this is hard at first, right? If you don't know a single word of your language and you're starting out as an apprentice, your mentor might just be talking and talking and talking, and you don't understand a thing. But you'll start to pick it up, and most mentors have ways to teach without expecting you to know the language or translating things, right? For example, if I come up to you and I go, cup, you're probably going to pick up on the fact that this thing is called a cup. And you can start building up your vocabulary little by little through real life doing things and using language for it, the way anybody learns a language outside of a classroom setting. And in addition to learning the language, this is also a really beautiful way to strengthen relationships with elders. Building those relationships is as much a part of language revitalization as the language learning itself. And these are great because the Mentor Apprentice program is great because it doesn't require special equipment or money or a specific building that can hold 15 3-year-olds. You just need two people who are willing to spend a great deal of time together working on language. And this model was developed in the 90s in California in the US by Leanne Hinton and her colleagues at Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. And sorry, I have a typo here. It was first used for Indigenous languages in California. It is now also used in Canada, but all over the world as well. You will find mentor-apprentice programs on pretty much every continent where people are revitalizing languages. And this book, How to Keep Your Language Alive, is an incredibly useful resource for anybody interested in the mentor-apprentice program. So one example in Canada is the Prairies to Woodlands Indigenous Language Revitalization Circle. For many years, they've been running a mentor-apprentice program for all of the Métis languages, so Michif, Cree, Ojibwe, and Dakota. And oftentimes, the mentor and the apprentice are family members. It's very common to have like a parent and child, or a grandparent and grandchild, an auntie and a nephew, whoever. But it doesn't have to be a family member. It can just be anyone who knows the language fluently and any younger adult who wants to learn. And Prairies to Woodlands was really getting their mentor apprentice program off the ground when COVID hit. And that would have been incredibly discouraging, and a lot of people might have given up, but they did not. They adapted the mentor apprentice program to do it over Zoom during the worst of the pandemic. And they kept going, and it's still going strong. They have some great articles out about how to adapt mentor apprentice programs to Zoom or other online platforms if you need to. And they also provide training and support to the mentors and the apprentices, right? It's not always easy to figure out how to do this kind of teaching and learning if you're not trained in it. So they really make sure everybody has the support to both give and receive the language. So, what if you want to work on getting language to more than one person at a time? And what if you want to get language to kids, but you can't do it in schools? Language camps and learning on the land are really great options here, not only for kids, but for adults too. Because learning language on the land is powerful, the same way being on the land is powerful for all sorts of reasons, right? This can involve group activities, right? We're all going to go on a hike together. It can involve an actual camp, right? Like we're going to spend a week, a month, a few months in a specific place all together, immersed in the language together. This has benefits beyond just language learning, obviously. You're building relationships within the community, you're gaining new skills and cultural knowledge, right? A lot of times, language camps involve learning other things besides language, learning how to gather food, learning how to fish, learning how to make things, learning how to cook things. And it's also a really wonderful opportunity to connect with land and with living beings and with the world around you as part of your language learning. It's very different than learning in a classroom in a building. Especially, again, me as a not an Indigenous person, as the settler, I don't have the knowledge or experience of what it means to be on your own land. But from what everyone writes and says about it, it is profoundly powerful, especially in language learning. And so, land based learning, weekend or summer camps, gatherings to do activities on the land, these are possible without an enormous amount of resources. Yeah, it takes some resources to, make sure everybody has stuff to eat and places to sleep and things to do and hopefully compensate the staff a little bit. But this is the sort of thing that it is possible to do from within the community without getting some sort of massive government funding. So this is a great option for a lot of folks to work towards too. And an example that is very dear to my heart is the IASA summer camp that is now happening every single year in Iboje in Cameroon. This is a community I was privileged to work with for my PhD research. And as you can see, it's a coastal community in Cameroon, in Central Africa. And a lot of kids who are IASA are now kind of growing up away from IASA territory. They're growing up in the city. Maybe they don't have the opportunity to learn or speak IASA very often. But a lot of kids come home from the city during school holidays over the summer. And a lot of kids spend the summer in the village with their grandparents, with their families, where they have the opportunity to hear and learn IASA. And so the summer camp sort of drew on this opportunity when kids were already back in EASA country for the summer. They thought, well, let's organize a language camp for the kids who aren't getting the chance to learn the language during the rest of the year. And so in 2022, they started as just a little 3 day camp. Little, that's still pretty big, but they started as a 3 day camp. And this past August, they served more than 200 kids for 3 weeks. And next year, the goal is 400 kids for an entire month. So this is huge growth, and the kids are learning so much over that time. And again, it's not just language. This is learning on the land as part of a language camp. So they're learning about ocean knowledge. They're learning how to make crab traps. They're learning dance. They're learning how to cook, all kinds of things that are wrapped in with language. And it's being organized and funded pretty much entirely from within the EASA community, which is incredible. And so, yeah, again, this is such a multi-layered set of benefits that language camps and land-based learning can offer. They're quite feasible in a lot of contexts if you can gather enough community support. And so there are a few resources here if you are interested in maybe organizing language camps in your community. The First Peoples Cultural Council has a great handbook called Culture Camps for Language Learning in English. ELP has recently created a translation in Igbo, and there's a Spanish version coming from ELP very soon. There's also the Nehioak Language Experience Camp Guide, which is from an ongoing long running language camp in Canada. Check that out too. And then you're asking, is that it? Can I only do a mentor-apprentice program? Do I have to do a language camp? No, there are like infinite ways that you can approach language revitalization. Everything we just talked about was an innovation from within a community or multiple communities. And so that innovation could be coming from your community next, right? I'm sure each and every one of you have some great ideas for other ways to bring language back into your community and your lives. There are so many things that are possible. You could have song or poetry competitions, you can have video games in your language, you can have therapeutic programs for folks whose, traumatic experience are keeping them silent speakers. You could dub movies in your language or film your own. You could put up signs around town, whatever works. It's about figuring out what is happening in your community and finding creative ways to address it that fit your context and your culture and the folks you're working with. And so, you're just the handful of ideas for things that any of us could do tomorrow, now, as soon as we hang up off this call. You could create domains in your everyday life where you or your family only speak your language, right? A lot of people do this. They say the kitchen is a language only zone. They put up signs all over every part of the kitchen that have like the words for stove and cupboard and pot and water, whatever. You could find or become a mentor. If you are a strong speaker, you could find someone who wants to learn, and you could make an agreement to spend time on a consistent basis using only the language to really strengthen those speaking skills. You could start a group that just does an activity together once a month. It doesn't have to be all that often. Just start a knitting circle where you knit and you talk in language, and that's what you do. You could do a project highlighting an interesting or an important part of your language or your culture that might get other people in your community interested in learning more or getting involved, right? You could, I don't know, film some little TikTok clips about this is my favorite word. You could do a tutorial on how to sew a patch onto a shirt in your language, whatever you're interested in. You can use that to get other folks involved and interested. And making social media content is a great way to do that. We have a really helpful tutorial by a past ELP intern on making social media content in your language. You could make signs, right? Maybe your school could use a sign or two that has the word for library in your language. Maybe even just on your own street corner, you could start labeling the names of trees if this is legal and allowed and nobody's going to get mad at you, right? You could just create visibility for your language in your everyday life. What else? There are so many ideas that I'm sure all of you have. Drop them in the chat if you're thinking, hey, I have an idea for something I could do with my own language and my own community. And it's okay if this all feels a little overwhelming or intimidating. That's so normal. It's a really challenging thing to figure out what might work best for you and for your community. And that's why the ELP Language Revitalization Mentors are here to talk with you. All four of them have firsthand experience revitalizing their own languages in very different contexts. And they all have expertise and knowledge about different aspects of language revitalization. And so please feel free to reach out, make an appointment with any of them. Uh, they're totally free. You can make as many appointments as you want. I'm going to drop the link in the chat for how you can make an appointment. And they are all really nice. Don't be intimidated. They are wonderful, warm, helpful people. And next year, if you still are wondering, I'm not really sure where to start, what to do, I want to learn more. Next year, ELP is going to be launching our new website, which includes the Language Revitalization Learning and Help Center. And this is a really massive online resource for folks who are working in or getting started in language revitalization. So this includes free learning resources like guides for starting a language camp, stories from language revitalization programs around the world to sort of help you get inspiration from what other folks are doing. There will be an events calendar and discussion forums to help you connect with other folks who are doing things that interest you or that you might want to collaborate on. And there is a global directory and map of revitalization programs so that you can see what people are doing in your country and the country next to you, someplace maybe that you have friends and you want to learn more about. And you can be in that directory and on that map. Feel free to share about what you are doing. All right, before we get into funding, I'm going to check the chat for questions. If you have any questions about revitalization methods, let's hear them. I see from Michael Carlo in the Waray language of the Central Philippines, the language revitalization centered on creative writing workshops. Yeah, that's awesome. That's a fantastic way to do language revitalization. If you have a link to where we can read any of those stories or poems or anything else, I'd love to see it. Nilima says, recently I developed mental health resources, specifically posters and infographics in Akuzapik. I'm so sorry if I said that wrong. My community really appreciated that. They're receiving mental health resources in their own language. That's incredible. Again, if you can share anything where we can learn more about that, I'd love to learn more. Thank you for letting us know. And Michael Carlo notes, after more than 25 years, this effort has produced a literature. I'm reviewing a novel in Waray. That is so cool. Oh, yeah. See, this is where things can go. You could be reading novels in your own language in the future. So, to make all this happen, sometimes, unfortunately, it does help to have some funding. It's an unpleasant reality that people deserve compensation for their time and labor, and some things cost money. And so everything goes a little easier if you can find a little funding for it. So let's talk a little bit about where you might look for funding. But first, an unpleasant truth, there is, in general, more money out there for language documentation than there is for language revitalization. Why do you think that is? Lots of reasons. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat. But yeah, one problem is that revitalization is one of those things that kind of gets kicked between funding areas. Some people say, oh, education funding should cover that. Some people say, oh, arts and culture funding should cover that. Some people, very few people say that health and wellness funding should cover that, but I think it should. But if we, there's also the fact that things that are coded academic, things that have, scholarly overtones like like language documentation are often better funded than community initiatives, which is lousy, but it's currently the way of things. And let's everybody work to change that. Oh, and I see Stuart has shared an article about a language nest he coordinates in South Australia. Fantastic. That's awesome. But let's talk a little bit about options for funding your documentation work, since we have been talking about documentation for the last 8 weeks. One of the major funders out there for this work is the Endangered Languages Documentation Program, or the ELDP. ELP sometimes gets mixed up with ELDP. We are not ELDP. They have way more money than us, but they're great funding for language documentation. So they fund applications anywhere in any country, but they often prioritize languages that are more endangered. So if your language is relatively stable, you probably have a worse chance of getting ELDP funding. They offer small grants, small, up to £10,000. That doesn't sound that small to a lot of folks, but that's for sort of small scale documentation projects. They also offer scholarships for PhD students who are doing documentation of 1 to 3 year projects. Same thing for postdoctoral fellows. If you have recently completed your PhD, you can apply for funding for a 1 to 2 year documentation project. And then the major documentation project category is up to £150,000. They've actually moved to Germany now, so convert that to euro, but somewhere around that much. And that is for really big, multiple year documentation projects with multiple researchers. One thing to note about ELDP is that it is pretty much exclusively for academics or teams with an academic linguist on them, maybe also an academic anthropologist or something along those lines. So if you are not academically affiliated, if nobody on your team is an academic, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get grants from ELDP. So if you need to team up with an academic linguist and propose a project together, that's an option. If that's just not a good option for you, that's okay. Let's talk about some other ones. So the Firebird Foundation, they offer grants to document oral literature in Indigenous languages, and the grants are up to $10,000 US. Again, pretty much only for anthropologists and linguists, but at least you do not have to have a PhD. You can be a student in those fields. But the next funders I'm going to talk about are more open to community-based work rather than purely academic work. And they also fund revitalization. And again, I'm talking entirely about very international funders, right? These are programs that fund people basically anywhere in the world. Your own country might have country-specific funding. So, I know some of you are in the Philippines. I think the KWF offers funding for documentation. In Australia, there's definitely some government funding out there for language work. So look around locally and see what you can find. And again, if you have questions, please reach out to the revitalization mentors. They are happy to help you find those resources. But here are some programs that fund language revitalization anywhere in the world. And the first one that I would recommend would be the Endangered Language Fund. Their program, Language Legacies, is open to folks anywhere in the world. It can be documentation or revitalization work. The grants are up to about $2,000, and you don't have to be an academic, right? You do not have to have a PhD or be affiliated with a university. Anybody who proposes a good project is eligible. And if you happen to be based in the US, the Native Voices Endowment is another really great funding opportunity. These are grants up to $10,000 for revitalization projects by a specific number of tribes who came into contact with the Lewis and Clark expedition. I don't know why it's structured this way. I assume it's the donor who gave this money stipulated that. And then if you are an academic, if you're a PhD student, there's also the Sharing Language Diversity Fellowship. And these are grants up to $30,000 for folks who are doing language documentation. The Foundation for Endangered Languages, a little confusing. The Endangered Languages Fund and the Foundation for Endangered Languages are different. This is a UK-based foundation that fund specifically revitalization projects. And they are small-ish grants up to $1,000 US, but you can do a lot with that in a lot of places. And I believe their grant round is now open, due December 31st. So check out agmios.org to find out more about how to apply for those grants. And then finally, the Cultural Survival Indigenous Community Media Fund is for revitalization programs focused on any type of community media. They fund a lot of radio stations, but it can also be written publications, newspapers, magazines. I'm not sure if they support social media work, but other types of community media are eligible. And these are grants of, I think, roughly about $5,000 US, plus training and support from Cultural Survival. And that grant is also open right now, so check it out and see if applying might be a good match for you. And finally, there is the option of crowdfunding. I don't know how many of you are from the US, but you're probably familiar with this as the way many people pay their medical bills here. This is essentially where you just start a web page and ask people to support whatever you are doing, and ask other folks to chip in money. And so the plus and the minus is that it relies on individuals donating money. This means you don't have to fill out any grant applications, there's no paperwork to do. But the downside is you also have to know people who can and will give money. So this can be really good for smaller fundraising projects if you just need to raise a relatively small amount of money, or if you want to really get people in your community invested, right? Ask people to contribute a really small sum, but then they feel sort of invested in your project, like they're part of it. And this is also a really good option if you have friends or colleagues in countries with stronger currencies, right? Maybe they can donate an amount that represents like a dinner to them, but would be a really big contribution to a revitalization program. So consider that if you have friends in wealthier countries. And those are some of the overviews of ways to approach language revitalization and a little bit about how to find funding for it. And so I think we have a little time for questions for anybody to share thoughts or ideas for ways that they might go about language revitalization in their communities. And I will stop the slides there and we will just have a little chat. I see in the chat that Ilima says, this summer I conducted a pilot survey on language attitudes within the community. And the survey also gathered revitalization ideas from community members. Oh, awesome. And based off that pilot survey, we helped a community member to apply for a grant to do a community-wide attitude and revitalization survey. Nice. And that got accepted. Yay, congratulations. That's fantastic. Can't wait to hear what you find out with that survey. Uh, and I see a question from Elena. Are there possibilities for postdoctoral or doctoral studies at some universities in the US? Yes, there are. There indeed are. It really kind of depends on what languages you work with, what kind of things you want to study. If you have specific questions about academic programs that might be a good fit, please feel free to reach out to me or any of the revitalization mentors based on what country you're interested in. I also see a question. I want to take a postdoc in linguistics. Are there any opportunities at UH Manoa? I don't know, actually. There often are. And so ELP tries to share postdoc opportunities as we learn about them. So if anything comes up at UH Manoa, we will post it through ELP. If you are not already on the linguist list, that's also where a lot of postdoc and scholarship opportunities are posted. I will put that link in the chat. It's sort of like the disciplinary mailing list for linguistics. And let's see, in the chat, great ideas for revitalization, storytelling as a tool to teach the language while passing down traditional knowledge. Yes, absolutely. That is a fantastic idea. Storytelling is so, so key in transmitting language and culture. And we actually hosted an event about storytelling in Indigenous languages a year or two ago. So I'll send around a link to that recording on YouTube as well. We had a couple storytellers come and tell stories in their languages. It was awesome. Let's see, and while I'm waiting for other questions, just going to show off this shirt here. Pretty cool, huh? This is the first ever ELP t-shirt that we are making available to the public. This design is by one of our 2023 interns, Nicaela Leon, who is a Quechua children's illustrator. She did this incredible design for ELP's first ever t-shirt series. So if you are interested in one of those, I'm just going to drop the link in the chat where you can check those out. Oh, I feel a little weird doing basically a commercial, but I think these are really cool shirts, and maybe you will too. Yeah. Let's see. And I see a comment in the chat. While there is a strong emotional connection to the language in the survey that Nilima did, we observed a significant gap in the actual usage. Yeah. Yeah, that is really common. And I'd love to learn more about what you learned during that survey. But the gap between how people feel about a language and how often they are able to use it in their everyday life can often be pretty strong. And there are a lot of complicated reasons for that. So I'd love to learn what you found out in that survey. Let's see, any other questions? And again, reminder as always, if you have questions that we don't cover today, please reach out anytime to me, to the revitalization mentors. We are here to support you if we can. And if we don't have answers, we'll try and connect you with somebody who knows about whatever you're asking about. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions, and we are just about out of time. So, again, I want to thank everybody for being part of the documentation webinars again this year for our sixth year. This is the sixth year we have done these, and every year it continues to be a total joy to talk with all of you, to learn together, and to discuss language to support all of you in your language work. So, we hope to see you next year. Please fill out the survey that's going to come up on your screen when we end the session. It'll really help us to keep improving these sessions for all of you. And oh, one more question. The classic words of a language can be documented as part of cultural digitization? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Documenting important words, important traditional concepts, anything that you want to be sure future generations have access to. Great thing to document in whatever you're doing. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend and a safe and healthy and happy end of 2024. Wherever you are, be safe, be well, and we will see you at future ELP events. Take care, everybody. Be well.